You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. We got a really top-end guest today, Dr. Joseph Mercola. Dr. Mercola's bio is going to be super extensive, so it's better if he tells you. But what I can tell you is that he's been around for dozens of years in the alternative health space. Unfortunately, it's called the alternative health space. It really should be the mainstream health space. He comments and has an understanding of many, many aspects of health from what I've seen, and it's a fresh perspective versus the traditional, give you pills, do surgery on you, irradiate you, and hospitalize you type model. So, Joe, thanks so much for coming. How you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Yeah, if you don't mind, tell me about your history. What first inspired you to care about health?
Well, let me first clarify that I haven't been around for thousands of years, but I have had a presence on the internet for quite some time. We've been the most visited natural health site, which is the term I prefer to use, for the last 17 years. At one point, prior to Google decimating us and taking us out of the search engines, we had 30 million viewers a month, down considerably since then. But anyway, my passion is getting people better without drugs or surgery. And I've taught a lot of people around the world, millions, hundreds of millions of people actually, how to do that and protect themselves from the drug model and surgery, which is really not for their best interest typically. It's basically fraught with side effects and complications that never address the fundamental reasons why people are getting sick. So my site has been up before Google existed, actually, 22 years. And my first interest in health was actually in 1968 when I first started exercising. And actually when I took my first programming class, which was COBOL and Fortran in 1968. And was actually first online in 77. So I've been doing this for a while. I love technology, which is one of the reasons I was able to spread my message of natural health so effectively, because I've been a tech advocate for a long, long time. And I've got...
You're Dr. Mercola. What's your designation? Did you go and get a medical degree, or why are you called Dr. Mercola?
Because I'm a physician. That's the primary reason. So I went to medical school and graduated in 1982 and did my board certified family practice and finished that in 1985. Yeah, so I went to medical in 78, graduated in 82, and then I did a 3-year residency in family practice. And actually practiced quite conventional medicine for the first 5 or 6 years, and I transitioned over and started learning approaches that were getting people better than no one else could, and eventually had people coming from all over the world to see me. So I thought it would be wise to share this information to a broader people by having a website. And, I'm often criticized for selling supplements, but for the first 3 or 4 years of my site, we never sold anything. It was never designed to be a revenue-generating business. It was just designed and focused on helping people get better without dying prematurely from expensive and dangerous medications and surgeries. Well, I went into medicine and health to really get people healthier, not to treat disease like most of my classmates did. So I was an outlier at the beginning. And from there, I just didn't understand that there were a number of physicians already who had the similar interest. And it took me a while to find them and get networked in before I really started improving and increasing my understanding of how to use natural medicine to help people get better and healthy.
So what, 30 some odd years ago versus now, what are some of the big changes you've seen in people and their health?
Well, people are getting sicker on a regular basis. largely as a result of two primary issues: vaccines, which the use of vaccine recommendations has exploded since I started practicing. Initially, it was just a few. Now it's many dozens, is close to 100 vaccines. And then we've got the introduction of many more synthetic chemicals, including pesticides or herbicides like Roundup, which is being sprayed at the tune of 5 billion pounds a year in the world. So they combine those two and also the explosion of EMF exposures. You've got a recipe for biologic disaster.
Yeah, I sat and thought, the average person will, use shampoo with chemicals in it, deodorant. They may put on makeup, body sprays. They're using their phone and other equipment all the time. They're breathing in who knows what in the ambient. The food they're eating is processed, and it just seems like an all-out assault on the body from many, many angles. What are your thoughts there?
I'd agree. I'm not so sure how intentional it is. It's just an artifact of seeking to optimize revenues for many of these multinational corporations without any regard to long-term health. Some of these companies like Monsanto and Bayer understand and know quite clearly the dangerous consequences of their products. Others are just ignorant, and there are large, massive loopholes in many of our protective regulatory agencies that really don't even require safety testing in many of these chemicals, let alone the synergistic combination of many of these chemicals. So it's actually a prescription for disaster. And we're seeing that. This is the first generation in the history of the United States that will not live as long as the previous generation.
Yeah, when people say that, how much less do people anticipate that they will live, or will they live same number of years just in a less healthy way? They'll be more disabled.
No, it's significantly less. It's going down. The lifespan is going down, probably by a few years, but we have an optimized lifespan and health span at the same time. So what we have really focused on is getting people to live longer, usually in a decrepit state, frail and in a bedridden or in a wheelchair, with many chronic diseases. So the goal is to live well beyond 100 years, which is biologically more than possible, without any frailty, without any dysfunction, and having the full capacities you had when you were 30, 40, and 50 years old.
So it seems like scientists are saying that people are not going to live as long this current generation. But what about health span? How will that be impacted? Same way? Shorter health span?
Oh, absolutely. Probably even accelerate more quickly. That doesn't mean everyone's listening to this is destined to that future. If you understand these fundamental biological principles and apply them to yourself personally, you can avoid this disaster. And many of the people who follow my site, and certainly me, plan on avoiding that completely, and have, for the most part, been successful at doing that.
What's it like from the perspective of of an average person? You think are they just going along, feeling fine, and then things are slowly creeping on them, and then all of a sudden they're in this new regime where they're not feeling well, or they're now become somewhat disabled? Like what do you think is the experience and the mental model of people as they age?
Well, you just, from an observational perspective, you can see it in the disease statistics. We have epidemics of Alzheimer's, which is on the far end. They lose their mind, the ability to think clearly and have any mental clarity or memory. But you also have epidemics of diabetes and obesity, high blood pressure, myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, and cancer. So all these diseases are going up. Arthritis is another one. So people are suffering from them, and most people are taking multiple medications. That's a really good indication that they bought into the model, because you shouldn't be taking any medications. It's the rare indication that there's ever a drug that you need to take. I mean, not to say they should never be used, but they should certainly rarely be used. We're probably using it more than 3 orders of magnitude than we need to be. And the evidence of the opioid epidemic is a classic example. We've got probably significantly 4 times as many people died from opioid overdoses than they have from that participated in the Vietnam War or died in the Vietnam War.
It's crazy. Well, I guess to make it even worse, I just recently read the book Bottle of Lies with Catherine Eban, where she talks about generic drugs not even being what they are represented on their labels. So it makes it even worse.
Right. It's very interesting investigative journalist. I heard her 2 to 3 hour interview with Peter Attia, which is a lot easier to listen to than read her book. But I probably should interview her too. She did a really magnificent job. It focuses on the drugs, which we don't really get into other than to tell people they're dangerous. But this is another clear example of dangers that that's not even recognized, because even the major pharmaceutical companies are using these generics. So, and this was one of the biggest generic producing companies in the entire world in India. It was huge. It was a multi-billion-dollar company.
Yeah. So I would think a lot of people would, be frightened if they have high blood pressure or diabetes or some other condition, and they would be scared to not use the drugs that are recommended to them and scared to not follow their doctor's protocol. So what do people like that do? Like, how do they start to address, there's all these things. I guess there's a whole list of shoulds of things that they should do. But let's say someone has a condition that's recently diagnosed. They're still in that, oh my God, what am I going to do stage? What are some of your first recommendations for people on how to get a handle on their health?
Yeah. And the ultimate diagnosis or example of that for a diagnosis is cancer, which is, maximizes fear to the fullest. And, even though cancer takes many years to develop, they make you believe that you have to do something that very day or that week. Furthest thing from the truth. And then they make these decisions that have usually irreversible consequences as a result of the rashness and lack of proper investigation on what to do. But it's a good question because fear motivates many people. And the diseases you mentioned are, for the most part, pretty benign. They're very safe, and almost in every case is completely irreversible without medication. To treating that once you treat the foundational causes. So I'm biased, of course. I've been doing this for decades, and I would strongly suggest you go to my site, Mercola.com, because you will not. Previously, even as early as earlier this year, we could just say go to Google and figure it out, because Google was a democratic process. They didn't censor, but now they're censoring. They've removed my entire site from the search engine, and not just my site, but hundreds, if not thousands of other sites that share this information that can tell you what to do to get off the medications. But if you know what the sites are, you can just go to sites directly and use those sites. So my site is Mercola.com, and there's literally tens of thousands of articles there to go into this in great detail. So, but simply, there's two major principles that you can do. One is three, stop eating processed food. Two-thirds of the food that people eat in this country is ultra processed. And that is food defined that you can eat, that purchase at a gas station. That's 2/3 of the food people are eating. And then there's another, almost a third, up to 90% of the people eat are processed foods. So you want to stop eating processed foods. The most particular, you would think sugar is the worst, and most people believe that, but actually it's the processed vegetable oils that are particularly problematic, because sugar taken in large doses over long periods of time can develop something called insulin resistance, which is really at the core of most foundational diseases. So certainly long-term use of sugar is problematic. But short-term intermittent exposure and rational use of sugar is not a problem. What is a problem, even any small amounts of processed vegetable oils, usually from plants like corn oil, canola, cottonseed oil, safflower, sunflower. All these are highly perishable oils and easily damaged, and frequently are damaged, especially when they're cooked. And those aren't just burned for fuel. Those are integrated into your cell membranes, and they can cause damage for a long time after you've eaten them. So first thing is stay away from processed food. Make most of your food at home, or pay someone to do it for you. So someone should be making the food fresh in the kitchen every day. That's number one. Number two, which is not easy, but if you're looking for the long-term solution, and certainly it'll be less expensive in the long run. Not time-wise, but less expensive in the initial cost, and certainly far more expensive when you factor in the savings from all the disease and disability that you're going to incur from consuming processed foods. So that's number one. Number two is sort of an artifact of that, which is stop drinking fluids except for water. So eliminate the juices, the sodas. Fruit juices people think are healthy for you, and that's not true because they're highly processed. So they're nothing necessarily intrinsically wrong with fresh fruits, but fruit juices should be avoided, as should all soda, and that's including diet soda, because these artificial sweeteners are every bit as bad, if not worse, than the sugar. So switching over to that, and the third strategy, and these are powerful strategies. If you do all three of them, you can probably reverse 80% of disease. And the third one is something relatively new that many people probably haven't heard of, and it's called time-restricted eating. They may have heard of intermittent fasting, but it's more accurately called time-restricted eating. And some really prominent researchers have shown that first of all, 90% of the people listening to this, 90% are eating more than 12 hours a day. 12 hours a day. And that's 90%. My guess is 50% are eating from the time they get up to the time they go to sleep. So that is a prescription for biologic disaster, because it will not allow your body to engage one of the most powerful mechanisms it has to keep you healthy, which is the recycling, repair, and regeneration mode. And we call it autophagy, from two Greek words, auto meaning self, and phagy from the Greek word phagos, meaning eat. So it's self-eating. Your body essentially digests all the damaged intracellular parts that would otherwise hang around and clutter up the system and cause you massive problems and complications. And you can't activate that system if you're eating all day long. And our ancestors never did that. We were never designed. It's not about our genes. It's not about biochemistry. It's not our metabolic system to accommodate for this. So you can get away with it for a short term, but if you do it chronically, as most people do, you're going to get sick prematurely. You will gain weight. You will develop insulin resistance. You get diabetes, high blood pressure, heart attacks, strokes, cancer, you name it. So it's a simple strategy. You basically progressively and slowly decrease your eating window, the number of hours that you can eat, from 12 down to 10, down to 6, and maybe even eventually to 2 or 4 hours. 4 hours would be pretty challenging for most people. It's actually what I do, though. I only eat in 4-hour window, from 10 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Today it was 10:30 to 2:30. So, and you may say, oh, it takes iron willpower. Well, by doing that process, especially doing it gradually, you develop what's called metabolic flexibility. You have the ability to burn either fat or sugar seamlessly. Most people listening to this can't burn fat. They can only burn sugar because they're eating 24/7, and the only time they're not eating is when they're sleeping, and that's not enough time to deplete the liver primarily of glucose or glycogen. And as a result, there's never any need to burn fat because you always have glucose stores around, and that's not right. And when you do that on a long-term basis, you just lose the ability to burn fat, and so you gradually accumulate it and you store it, which is highly problematic and really a primary factor why so many people practically contributes to so many chronic diseases.
How long have you been doing restricted eating protocol?
I'd say 5 or 6 years.
Oh, wow. What was it like for you when you first tried it versus now?
Well, it was never really hard. I mean, I have enormous discipline, so it's a little bit of a challenge for anyone doing it the first week or two until you make the transition and you're metabolically flexible. Once you are, your body typically has enough fat stores to keep you alive for a few months, if not longer. Some people over a year. I mean, literally, they could almost fast and not eat anything or drink anything but water for a year and lose weight. Now, these are people who are typically over 400 or 500 pounds. And that's a good strategy. And interesting, when you lose weight that way, instead of going on a low-calorie diet, your autophagy system is radically upregulated. As a result, you don't have to go for surgery to remove the extra fat tissue from your skin, on your belly. That's a result that most people do because your body takes care of it. It just eats it and digests it for food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard about that, yeah. You don't end up with loose skin versus other weight loss methods.
Yeah. So that's the problem. People go on low calorie diets thinking that's going to be effective, but actually no calories is far more effective. And then doing that, and then maybe having a few days where you're eating and going in and out of that cycle. And cycling, it can be a really powerful strategy to get healthy quickly, especially if you have a challenge with a serious disease like cancer, where you have to do something quickly. So that's when you're getting into a very aggressive fasting mode, and seeing a clinician who understands how to treat the fundamental causes is really helpful.
Yeah, do you do periodic fasts where you won't eat at all for a day or two or more?
I was doing it for a long time. I would do a 5-day fast a few times a year, but I'm trying to gain weight, so it's really hard to do that. Even if I don't eat for a day, I tend to lose 3 or 4 pounds, maybe sometimes even 5 pounds. So I don't want to do that. I'm trying to keep on my muscle mass. So,
And then going back to the first thing you talked about, which is not eating processed food and making it yourself as much as possible.
mm-hmm.
I've noticed that what's difficult about food is that you can look at 2 pieces of chicken or 2 chicken dinners, and they may look to your eye the same, but one could be organic, grass fed, one could be, free range, one could be processed, and until you eat it, you may only be able to tell by taste and texture, but by eye, you can't see it. And it seems like that's one of the big challenges with even determining when you're out and about, is it possible to get non-processed food, or is that just?
It typically isn't. And I would advise most people to avoid eating chicken, especially if you're a woman and you have recurrent urinary tract infections, because if you bring raw chicken into your house, it almost invariably is contaminated with typically E. coli and salmonella. And all you have to do is touch it, and then you bring it into the house. It's on the sink, it's on the handles, and then the women wind up getting it, and they get a urinary tract infection from it. So that's one reason, but it's just not a good food to eat. That doesn't mean you shouldn't eat eggs. Some people are allergic to them. If you are, don't eat them, but chicken is not a good food to eat at all. I avoid it like the plague. Now, duck is fine. A goose is even better. Pheasants, other birds are fine, but chickens are, even if you're raising, I raise my own chickens. I have like 9 chickens. So I have about 6 eggs a day, mostly just the yolks, because you don't want to have excess protein. So, and there's a lot of eggs are probably one of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet, especially the yolk, not the whites. So a lot of good nutrients.
Even if you prepare your own chicken and you get what you think is good organic free range chicken, you're saying not a good idea?
If you were doing that, it's probably okay. But then and not only do you have to raise it, then you have the challenge of preparing it, and that's another. Some people are good at it. I'm not, and so I just don't enjoy that. I get it from most of my meat from an organic farm, actually a biodynamic regenerative agriculture farm that raises these animals in a humane way and actually contributes to decreased global warming, because when you raise animals in a way that it's not industrially like industrial farming, then you actually increase the carbon content of the soil rather than putting it into the atmosphere like traditional farming does, or raising of animals or agriculture.
Yeah, I want to point out the hidden problems, or at least they seem hidden. So why is it impossible or nearly impossible or so difficult to get non-processed food if you eat out? What if I go to a place that cooks it in front of me? Is there any benefit to that, or it's meaningless?
Well, you have to look
at a restaurant.
You have to look at their supply and sources. So where are they buying it from? I mean, there's really, most people don't understand that there is no penalty for a restaurant to lie on its menu. They could say whatever they want, and no one's going to come in there and give them a fine. Now, there is a penalty for their integrity, and if people start finding out about it, they might lose business, but there's no legal penalty for it. And most people aren't aware of that. So, I mean, you've got to know where they're getting their food from. And once you go into a restaurant, who goes into the back of the kitchen or talks to the manager or the owner to see where their sources are? Like hardly anyone. So you just have to assume the worst. Now, there are exceptions, and there are restaurants that are known for committing themselves to providing the highest quality food. And they exist. They're few and far between, but they're out there. In my own community, there's only really one restaurant in our entire community that does this. So, but there are others that say they would be organic or, wild caught fish, and they can give you the worst farm raised fish and not pay a penalty at all. And you would be no the wiser except you pay for it. And this is well documented in many books.
I don't know what percentage of restaurants lie, but do you think it's a pretty significant percentage?
It's high enough that you're going to, if you're eating out regularly, you're going to encounter it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen reports where they'll tell you you're getting fish A and it's actually fish B.
Right. Yeah, and the higher the price of the fish, the more likely that's going to be, because the potential for increased profits increases pretty dramatically. So they'll advertise it from really expensive fish and give you something that's essentially not. And they prepare it in a way there's no way to tell.
That's what I was going to ask you. What if someone's like, "Oh, I can tell. I've had much fish or much meat in my life, and I can tell." Is that true, or has anyone even studied that?
I don't know. I mean, some people might be able to discern that. They'd have to have a pretty sensitive palate. But most of the time they put sauces on it and they disguise the texture and the appearance so that it's like really physically almost impossible to do it.
What about I guess I'd call it the European vacation effect. It seems like, even Peter Attia said this too, you go over to Europe and you eat things maybe you wouldn't even eat here, and yet somehow you feel a lot better and less inflamed and lose weight. Have you looked into that, and is there any idea in your mind why?
Well, Europe typically, in many countries, they are more assiduous about avoiding some of these dangers like GMOs and non-organic foods. So, and their grains that they use typically tend to be a bit better. So it's a little bit easier in Europe, but it's still a challenge, and you've got to be very careful.
Yeah, it's not a panacea, but I just wondered if you've experienced that effect yourself, and
no,
any thoughts on it.
I typically don't go to Europe, so
okay. And maybe you eat so well that if you went there, you'd be worse off. So.
It's possible, but typically when I travel, and I do travel almost once a month, I bring my own food and my own water.
Really?
Yeah, I don't eat out.
Wow,
yeah,
that's great. Well, in terms of containers, I mean, people would use, let's say, maybe plastic Tupperware versus glass. How important is the container if you're going to do this?
Well, it depends on what you're putting in it, but typically glass is always better. So that's my primary strategy. I put my food in glass containers and travel with them. So it's not hard to do. I mean, you're typically going to have to check your luggage, which is fine. I always check my luggage, so I'm pretty much prepared.
You don't have problems when you go through TSA that they're eyeing out your food?
No, it's the luggage is checked, so it's not an issue.
Mm-hmm. I gotcha. Yeah, I guess the benefit of time-restricted eating is tremendous, because if you're going to make all your own food, mm-hmm. and you're not time restricted, I can see someone saying, "Oh, that's a lot of work, and I have to bring all this stuff with me, and it has to be refrigerated." But if you're time restricted, it's definitely conceivable that at least half of what you eat during the day, or most of it, is eaten while you're at home. If you just eat before you go to work and then eat when you get home, that probably takes care of it. You don't have to take stuff with you.
No, you don't. You don't, but you could, and it's not that hard to do. I mean, I do it when I travel. I'll bring all the food for 2 or 3 days, typically. Usually, if it's longer than that, I'll make sure I'm in a place where I can get food. But it's really hard when you're traveling to find good food, and that's an understatement. It's very hard.
So, are you still in the direct patient advisor role at all, or is it just your? Okay, but
I've stopped seeing patients about 12 years ago.
But I'm sure you speak with many practitioners that do see patients.
Sure, all the time.
What do they find that people have a hard time with? Let's say talk about the time-restricted feeding or the not eating processed foods. Like, these recommendations are excellent, but what are the things that really make it difficult for people to follow them?
Well, usually the biggest challenge is social issues. So especially if you have a family. So if, I stop eating before 3 and many people are working at that time, and when they come home, they have a wife and children, and dinner is typically viewed as a social gathering and connection where you connect with your family. So that is a potential problem, but it could be solved. It's easily solved. I mean, you don't have to eat. You can still have that time together and share it and drink water or do something as a family. So it's just typically done with food. So I think that's probably the biggest issue.
Well, you find family members and friends of the person that is undergoing, this transformation. They say, "Come on, eat something," or, "You're going to starve yourself," or, is there a lot of pressure socially?
Depends on their family. Could be, but
yeah,
most everyone in the family would benefit from doing this, except if there was a family member who was pregnant or was underweight or was a child. You typically don't want to put a child or a pregnant woman on time-restricted eating. Not a good idea.
Yeah, makes sense.
So, but if that's not typically the case. So if that isn't the case, then almost everyone in the family is going to benefit. So it's going to help them too. And it's going to slow down the aging process quite dramatically. And more importantly, improve the health span, the time that you're going to be able to live with having full capacities.
Do you find that, I don't know, people's food bill goes down, or do they eat tons of food in the small restricted window of time?
No. There's really no limit to the amount of food you can eat or should eat. It's not. This is not something where you count your calories. Normally, for most people, having less carbohydrates is typically a better strategy, and avoiding most of the grains, especially gluten grains, which should be not only wheat but barley, rye, oats, and spelt. So that's typically a good strategy, and because most of them are contaminated with glyphosate or Roundup. That's one. Even it'd have to be organic, and even then, it still may be contaminated. You just don't know. Yeah. You'd have to test it yourself to be sure, and it's probably not a bad idea if you're going to be consuming that food for lots of it for a long period of time. And the tests aren't terribly expensive. It's about $100 or so.
What about what is eaten during the time that you do eat? Non-processed, great. But what about the macro composition? Do you, what is your thoughts on veganism versus carnivore diet or keto? Or
Well, I'm not a big fan of veganism, that's for sure. I think everyone needs some animal protein. If you were to do one thing, there seems to be a lot of benefit to being carnivore and removing all vegetables and fruits from your diet because lots of people notice, especially if they have autoimmune issues, that it tends to improve quite dramatically. So that's a big plus. But it's a bit more challenging to do because you have to have high quality sources, and you just can't eat ribeyes and steak all day long. There needs to be a more comprehensive carnivore approach, which is typically nose to tail, which includes not only the muscle meat, but the organ meat, and then also connective tissue, because you have to balance out these amino acid ratios, specifically methionine and glycine. So, but done correctly, it basically is a pretty strict keto. So you have very low carbs, and you're generating really high amounts of ketones, and your insulin levels very low, and your blood work looks really, really excellent for most people who are doing this, and most of their autoimmune diseases just disappear. So it's an interesting, especially if you combine it with time-restricted eating.
Yeah, I guess that's the 1-2 punch, really.
Yeah.
A couple more questions about the time restriction. Have you seen much benefit if someone goes to, from 16 hours of eating down to 12 even? Is there a big improvement there, or do you really need to get down into the,
no,
4-hour window?
Hardly anything at 12 hours. It really, the magic doesn't start to happen until a minimum of about 14 and probably closer to 16, because you have to exhaust those glycogen levels, and you just don't do it in 12 hours. I mean, it's a start. It's certainly better than eating for 16 hours, but you really need to restrict the eating to it. I would say a minimum of 14 to 16. I do 20 hours, which is probably unnecessary for most people, but the goal really should be 16 hours, I think, which gives you 8 hours to eat. That's a long time. I mean, that's twice the long time I'm eating.
Well, yeah, from your perspective, right? Yeah. But from someone that's eating constantly, that's like, oh my God, I'm going to starve.
No, that's the thing. Once you're metabolically flexible, and I didn't emphasize this enough, it's really almost magical. Your cravings disappear. You are not hungry, and I can assure you with the highest degree of confidence, this is not a test of mental willpower at all. You just aren't, but you got to do it slowly to get to that phase. You're just satiated. You're full. You're satisfied. There's no temptations. There is a non-issue in every way, shape, and form.
So the thing to do then, it seems like first is, well, I guess, okay, so if you had to put your recommendations in order, it sounds like first thing should be try to make all your own food. Don't eat processed foods.
Yeah.
And then whenever you are eating, go low carb. Any other recommendations on the eating part and then the time restricted part, or is there an order in which people should do this?
Well, probably time restricted eating is the most important, because there's many animal studies that show really clearly that even if you have two animal populations and you give one access to food 24/7 and the other puts in a really rigid time restricted eating window, and they're given the same damn bad diet, the animals that are eating continuously just do terribly well, come on with all these diseases. They age prematurely and die much sooner than the other animals, even though they're eating the same bad food. So I would say, and it's a lot easier to do to restrict your eating window than it is to change the foods you're eating. So I would do that first, like right away, because then as you're feeling better and your health starts to improve, then you know this is working and you have the trust and confidence to adopt some of these other changes.
Well, if you're eating, lots of carbs and all that, having big blood sugar swings, it might be very hard to do the time restricted. That's why maybe
that's why you have to do it slowly. So you can do some of them. Cutting down the carbs first would be a good idea, but you don't go from eating 16 hours a day down to 4.
Yeah,
that's not going to happen. You will be a miserable person, I can assure you. And you might even get sick, and you'll have you don't do it rapidly. And this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. So you can do it over a few weeks, and a few weeks is more than enough time to make the transition.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So you said that about 80% of health issues, from your observation, appear to be resolved if you do these things you're mentioning.
Yeah, just those 3 things would probably be enough. Now, maybe it's a little less than 80, but probably close to 3/4 of the people are going to get better, noticeably better. Mm-hmm. And to get rid of some of the other things, it becomes more problematic, and there's a lot of other things you need to do. And seeing a physician or clinician who understands these principles and is able to customize it for you would be helpful.
Yeah, how do you find a doctor that understands these things and not a traditional one? Like, how do you? Is it a functional doctor, or does that not even enough? Like.
That is a good question. So it is a challenge. Probably the best recommendation I have is to go to your local health food store. Go to several of them in your community, and almost every community has them, and ask the owner, ask the employees who they would recommend locally, who's good, and then ask your friends and neighbors. You need to tie into a network that's sort of socially validated, the clinicians there, because it doesn't matter what certification, what courses you took, who you know. I mean, ultimately, it boils down to that clinician understanding the principles and having a personality that's able to engage and catalyze people to action and get results. So once a person starts doing that, and any significant number of people, the community will know. You just have to tie into that.
Okay. Well, very good. Any what resources would you suggest? Is it just Mercola.com is the best way, or what ways would you suggest for people to find out
I would
more?
say Mercola.com. I've got a new book coming out in the spring. Actually, the spring. Maybe the winter. It might be February. It's on EMF, which is another danger, the abuse of. We could spend 3 or 4 hours talking about this. But 5G is coming. We've got the 5G global satellite internet coming. It's already being deployed. We've got 60 satellites up there now broadcasting these signals. So we're going to be inundated with these EMFs, and that's another way that you can cause harm and biological damage. It didn't exist before, really. Just if you think about it, as I said earlier, I was on the internet in the 70s, and I'm sure you can remember even from the last century that when you were on the internet, it was not wireless. It was all wired.
Right. Yeah.
Initially, it was a phone cable. You dialed in through the phone modem, and that was it. And then it switched to the Ethernet cables, but it was all a wire. The wireless didn't come until this century. So we have this exponential. It's not even exponential. If you go back a century, I mean, the magnitude of the increase in the frequencies that we're exposed to, the biological frequencies of concern, have gone up 10 to the 20th. That's 100 billion. Yeah. So if that intrigues you, I've written a book, comes out and it's called EMF'd. And I am giving away a large portion of the most important chapter, which tells you how to mitigate against this, how to save and protect yourself and your family from that. So if you just go to my website, emf.mercola.com, that's MERCOLA, emf.mercola.com, you'll be able to sign up for the newsletter and then get as a bonus this, I think it's a 30-page report, very colorful graphics, very easy to read and understand, of what you can do to protect you and your family from this exposure to EMFs.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Well, I have your tube headphones that I bought, the blue ones.
Yeah,
so,
that's a start, but believe me, that's nothing more than a drop in the bucket compared to their other exposures. Mm. And most people, the idea, one of the, with respect to the simple things you can do there, the equivalent of time restricted eating would be to make sure that your phone isn't on when it's on your body. It should be in airplane mode. Mm. Because, most people, how long does it take you to charge, or how long does the charge on your phone last?
Well, mine lasts about the day. That's it. But I use it a lot.
Okay.
But yeah.
But that means you're like most people. So do you ever wonder what happens to that energy?
Well, I would hope it mostly gets dissipated, but I'm sure part of it gets dissipated into me.
Into you, right. And especially if you're wearing it in your pocket like most people do when it's on.
Mm-hmm.
So all that energy that you're charging, that power is going somewhere. Now, when I have a phone and it's on all the time, but guess how long my phone lasts, my battery lasts, rather, the charge?
A week, I guess, if you're in airplane mode all the time.
2 weeks. 2 weeks. So now I do use it if I'm traveling. I'll use it for a lift. If I have to get a quick look at my emails quickly, I'll look at it. But basically, it's in airplane mode. And I connect to the internet through a wired connection. There is no Wi-Fi router in my house. There's very low radiation. And all the tips and tricks on how to do this are in that chapter. So it's emf.mercola.com.
Okay, that's great. It's a good resource.
Yep.
Well, Joe, you took a lot of time. I appreciate it, and I'm glad that you're a pioneer and an ongoing advocate for everyone's health. So thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.